So, Mr. President, again, welcome and thanks everybody. This is, I think, the third year I speak at this conference, and it's probably the third year I'm going to say exactly the same thing again. So I don't know if anyone's been here before, just raise your hand. You can probably go for early coffee. A lot of what I've said has already been said before, but I'll go through it, maybe give you a flavour of industry's perspective on a few things, and give you some concluding remarks, and maybe some of it touches on some of the stuff that's already been mentioned. I think if I was to sum it all up is we need to move on. I mean, we're 3 years now discussing this. It's been well debated in Parliament, it's been well debated in Council, and it's actually getting to the point where it's hurting everybody. I mean, we're all still stuck on talking about the negatives, and I was glad to hear about, let's talk about the benefits and the positives. But because it's going on so long, everyone's still stuck, because all the benefits are in the new legislation, the new regulation, and the new way of operating. And the benefits are in the improvements that Eric talked about the current implementation. And a lot of that is being held up because the people who need to do the work are stuck in Council, having two-day meetings every 2 weeks, instead of spending 2 days doing market surveillance and checking notified bodies. So I think there's a real need to move on. Let's stop, philosophizing about whether it should be central, decentralized, whether it's this or that. We have some good ideas on the table, and I think we should just move forward with them. So I think that's maybe the overall message. I could probably finish there, but let's have a look at a few pictures. Where are we? Well, we're kind of here under the Latvian presidency, discussing the Council position. Since I last talked to you, and as Eric said, we have the Parliament's position since April, and we want to get onto this stage, this trilogue, which is where you have the Commission present while the Council and the Parliament thrash it out to make a final text. And as Professor Bolton said, that could be agreed, let's say, at the end of this year, but that means it's at least 3 years or 5 years before we actually fully apply the legislation. But as you know, a lot of people move ahead of that, but at least we're on the right way, and we know with legal certainty what we need to do. So that's the kind of timeline. Some say we'll finish maybe in the Luxembourg presidency. Some say perhaps even the Dutch presidency will finalize it in 2016. So that's the kind of where we are. A little bit of a snapshot, and you've heard some of this. In the Council, we have the Latvians taking care of it. They're applying a systematic process, and everyone's quite hopeful they'll get the job done. In the meantime, Member States are applying the Joint Action Plan, and I can tell you from an industry point of view, our members are feeling the heat. It is a stronger applied legislation, much more deep dive into clinical issues, much tougher questions being asked, more audits happening, unannounced audits, so things have changed. In the Parliament, we have Glenis Willmott as the rapporteur, waiting to do the negotiation. She has her mandate. She has her text. She's waiting for the Council to finish. The good thing I would say about Ms. Willmott is she was previously involved in the clinical trials legislation, so she's, in a sense, familiar with the health issues and some of the questions that are there. The Juncker Commission, as you've mentioned, or was mentioned, and there's some administrative movements. From our point of view, that doesn't really change anything because it's still one commission. And actually, when you look at medical technology and mHealth and all these questions, it's actually dispersed throughout the Commission. There's bits of it in the digital part of the Commission. The HTA question still sits in Sante, or the old DG Sanko, so that still sits there. The legislative part is now in Enterprise. So our demand always was, even before the changes, you need to link these bits together because they all answer the same question about safety and availability of medical devices. A quick word about the IVD regulation. I could go into it at detail, but I don't think there's really a point at this stage because the medical device legislation is a bit like the cuckoo that enters the nest. It shoves all the other eggs out and it sits there and it's the only one that gets fed. The debate in Council is only on the medical device legislation. They are not talking about the IVD directive. There's only a few member states actively involved. And they're the ones that have an industry and have an interest and actually maybe even have staff that are involved in vitro diagnostics. So with this audience and you're interested in diagnostics as well as devices, I think one of the important things that you should be shouting for is don't make a mistake and take the rules for a device which is going to go into a person and apply them to a diagnostic which is going to go nowhere near a person. They're completely different rules that you might apply to one type of science and the other type of science, and that's a real danger. And then for you who want to use or bring new products to market, you'll be faced with inappropriate rules, inappropriate requirements, and it'll just be a headache. So if I was one ask to you as a group would be to ask that the IVD directive gets properly debated before it's adopted. Some of this has been said, and Professor Bolton said at the beginning, and everyone knows that there's a good system because it has benefited patients and it has benefited Europe. It needs to be strengthened. I mean, everybody knows that. The Commission came with a very good proposal in these areas, and I think I talked to you before about that and what they wanted to do in terms of better coordination, more information available to the public, more coordination, better notified bodies, more market surveillance and vigilance. The Parliament, I would have to say, did a fairly good job as well of enhancing that, especially in the area of notified bodies, especially in one area. Let's see if my pointer works again. It does. Here, stakeholder involvement. The Commission was silent on this and said stakeholders are only needed when invited. And we made a noise about that as well, and I know a lot of people made a noise. The patients made a noise, and the Parliament listened and said, no, you have to have stakeholders like yourselves, like ourselves, like patients in the debate and in the setting of guidelines and new rules and standards. So that's a very important part. You heard about EMA oversight of special notified bodies. That was an interesting insertion, and that will be debated in Council to see whether they agree or disagree. The system for the route to market, as you know, and you heard about the Commission scrutiny, and I talked about it at previous conferences, the industry is not against scrutiny. We're a scrutinized industry. We're against the form of scrutiny that was proposed because it was a belt and braces approach. And we think that's inefficient. You either get the belt right, and there's no need to have a braces. So really just get the belt right. And we firmly believe that that's rooted in having the best notified bodies and having more clinical involvement from clinicians into the review of the clinical safety part. So get it right once. Don't do a double job. Oops. Yeah. That transpires, and you have this slide, you'll have it in the slide decks. But there's four main, I suppose, areas of debate, and I think Eric pointed to them as well, in terms of scrutiny, this market access process, what's needed on clinical evidence, about the reuse of products, and about hazardous substances and how they're used in technology. And we know where everybody is here in the Commission and the Parliament. We can only guess what's going on in Council. But on the scrutiny, you have a lot of member states who disagree. They haven't got the money to do things twice. They only want to do it once. And they want to strengthen the notified bodies, and they're thinking of bringing in these panels because they look at the idea of the Parliament and can see some merit in that. There's basically one country who doesn't want to do it, it's France. And so this is where the debate is. In clinical evidence, there seems to be two camps. There's one camp that doesn't want to take any risk with any product whatsoever and wants us to run clinical investigations for all products, from class 1 to class 3, do randomized controlled trials in all of these, and regardless of whether the evidence is there or not. And to the Helsinki Agreement, I think if you already know the science and there's no new knowledge to be gained, perhaps you shouldn't be doing a clinical investigation. But then the law will require you to do a clinical investigation, so now you have an ethical problem. So there's one camp that probably maybe is looking to just have complete security with no science. And then the other camp is looking at the science and saying, let's get the science right for clinical investigations and clinical evidence, and let's have a proper evaluation of that using these clinical experts that we were talking about previously. So it's a bit of a more connected solution or a more scientific solution, and that is what we would hope would win out at the end of the day. Reuse of single-use devices, I think there the Commission made, as I said before, a very good proposal, and it looks like the Council will probably land there as well. I think Germany are the only outlier there, and you will have a proposal that will settle on the more on the Commission's. The Parliament's aware that its position was a bit maybe mixed up or not the most brilliant, but they have some good ideas in there in terms of high standards for reprocessing of products. Hazardous substances, the Parliament wanted a ban. It's very normal for, I think, the Greens to win out in the Parliament and look for a ban. It's a way of moving everybody along a little bit, because if you don't ask for a ban, people won't even move an inch. So they know that, and I think the Council know that, and they'll probably go somewhere along identifying products and identifying if there are alternatives, then to move along. So that's kind of where the debate is from our perspective. I just want to talk about a few things like transparency. I mean, this is one of the problems with the legislation. Because you can't see into it, nobody trusts it. But there's a lot of provisions that will change that, and there'll be a lot more information available. This database and information adverse events should be available. The current framework, I won't dwell too long here because Eric talked a lot about it and I've mentioned it. It's already improved. Member states are already applying things. There was all this stuff about the joint actions, checking notified bodies, unannounced audits. There's stuff like member states. There's initiatives like Beyond Compliance in the UK, talking about how do you guide implants to the market. So there's people looking at more detail of how to apply the current legislation. One pet project of mine, these are the current groups in the Commission that meet and talk about the legislation. Most of these groups are voluntary. The ones on the right are legislative. They don't meet too often. And it's a bit of a mess when I lie at night and close my eyes. This is how they look to me. They're not connected. And they're also not connected at the moment because everybody's too busy working on the revision. And that means that the current system suffers. So what I'd like to see is more coordination between all of us, and you talked about working together. So you have the clinical community, the Commission, the authorities, the formal coordination group at the committee, the advisory committee, which would be you and us as representatives into groups to try and sort things out. Now, the Commission would need to run that, but while they don't run it, a lot of it is happening anyway. For example, in the clinical question, European Forum for Good Clinical Practice has already formed a joint workshop with, or working group, with industry to start teasing through the questions about clinical evidence in medical devices. There's been years and years and years of knowledge gained on clinical evidence in pharmaceuticals and medicines. There's very little, and it's still early science on medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, to be very blunt. So how do we establish what's there today and grow it? So this is and I'd invite you to join this group. There's lots of things we can do now as well. This database is a UDI database. There's no reason why we can't uniquely identify products today. We have the FDA rule that requires this. Our industry is geared up to do it. It's a no-brainer for patient safety. We should get on with it. But the Commission says, no, we have to wait for legislation. Can we have a public-private partnership to maybe try and improve patient safety? Diabetology, and maybe you mentioned it, and I talk about dialogue and coming in. I mean, I can imagine a group like this, and forgive me for thinking about what you might think, but I think in terms of competence in notified bodies, you probably have a lot to say or be able to give in terms of what a notified body, what would it look like, a competent body to approve and look at these products. Post-market surveillance system, what should it look like? How should it be set up? How could it be coordinated? Stakeholder involvement, engagement, your knowledge into what Commission groups to answer what questions. And standards, and I think a lot of you are probably involved in international harmonized standards and clinical guidelines. And this is where the real safety, I feel, hits, that's where the rubber hits the road. If it's not written in a standard or in a clinical guideline, then how does an innovator or how does a company know precisely how to make a piece of equipment or bring it to the market? Concluding remarks, and here, a little prop. So this just came out just the other day. So it's a Dutch ministry report, and I know every year at this conference there's been a discussion about the EU and the US system and comparing them and contrasting them, et cetera, et cetera. And the conclusions of this report, it's quite a good report. It's quite welcome because I think it's the first authoritative European report to look at this question. And what does it say? It basically says, well, both systems do exactly the same thing, and both systems are trying to improve. And that's where we are. If you look at that, I mean, the US system, they have quite a good document on post-market surveillance, how to improve that. If you look into their mission and strategic priorities, they talk about how to speed up the system, how to make it more attractive for innovation, how to innovate for safety for patients. In many ways, this document strikes me that the FDA is trying to be a bit more European. They've realized, oops, we've gone too far, we need to go back. In Europe, we have our directives and we have the joint action plan. So we've realized that, we need to properly and fully apply our legislation and in many ways go a little bit this way. So maybe the answer is somewhere in the Azores or something. As I've always said, and continually, our message hasn't changed. We just need, as industry, a clear, predictable framework. That's all. If it's predictable, we can follow, we can deliver. And that's where we look into the legislation, the scrutiny process, all these other things, the issues around clinical now. And our issue is it's not predictable. If it's not predictable, you don't have safety, you don't have innovation, and then the cascade begins. We need the trust of all stakeholders. I mean, that's evident from the issues that have gone on. Sustainability. If you want to have new ideas and new health, the system has to generate and facilitate entrepreneurship and growth of ideas and R&D and innovation in Europe. So that's all we ask. And that's basically to, as was said, to build on the strengths of the current system, get those notified bodies, the vigilance, the post-market surveillance, clinical evidence right, and please, that scrutiny piece, it's not about no scrutiny, it's about exchange it for one that works. That's it, thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, very clear, and it's clear that we really, I think, have to and can and wish to work together. One thing that came out of the article I was reading just the other day in the International New York Times, following this yet another scandal of knee surgery, is that the FDA officer said, actually, when it comes to classification of devices, there's no clear way as to how we do classify them, and the company might suggest, as they did, that this is actually a Class 1. So I just wonder, because I like the revision of notified bodies for Class 3 devices, but the devices we use in insulin infusion pumps and also continuous glucose monitoring in many ways are just as dangerous potentially. And shouldn't we be setting up, and perhaps you would agree with us, we would love to have proper notified bodies with actual expertise in diabetes, in infusion systems, and the potential advantages and dangers.
Yeah, I think we'd fully agree. I mean, one of the advantages in Europe is that we do have a classification system that you can apply, and generally in 99.99% of cases delivers the product into the right classification, and there's usually no question. I think in terms of precisely what should notified bodies doing when checking categories of products, that's precisely the role I would say you should be doing together with authorities and with notified bodies to say we would advise that these types of things should be checked. I think also your role is in helping to establish the standards and harmonize standards for those products, so when the body's checking, they know precisely the standard to be checked and the critical elements in that standard that perhaps need a more special focus to guarantee that the manufacturer is consistently producing a high quality product. So yeah, I would agree, yeah.
Thank you very much.